capacity.
Now with all this stuff.
Exactly. Right, so let's now have a look at the two main methods that were usually taught in how to cultivate this bodhicitta. So the two main methods that were historically taught on how to cultivate this bodhicitta were the 7 cause and effect method and the equalizing and exchanging self with others. The first one was the main method taught, and this one was only taught to few people because it was considered too difficult for the average person. I think in our modern world, this approach or method could be problematical, and I think actually this one in our modern world is probably much more suitable.
Can you read it, the second one?
Second one is equalizing and exchanging self with others. So the 7 cause and effect method, there are 2 reasons why it could be problematical in our modern society to use this method, and they're both in the first step. The first step is to see everyone as our mother. The reasoning being, and of course implicit in this statement, is a belief in rebirth. And the reasoning is that you have a mother in this life, in the previous life you had a mother. If you keep going back like that, you can, through that line of reasoning, you can understand everyone has been our mother at some point or other. So if we don't have a belief in rebirth, then that line of reasoning would be impossible. And the reason we want to do this, see everyone as our mother, is that historically at least, the mother is the person who benefited us most in our life. Carried us in the womb, gave birth to us, looked after us as a baby, fed us, clothed us, and helped probably with education and so forth. But I think, unfortunately, again, in our modern society, often, or sometimes at least, people have difficulties with their mother. So if they see everyone as their mother, they may start hating everyone instead. So then sometimes the text says, well, you can substitute father, brother, sister, because we've had all these relationships with everyone. So this is the first step, to see everyone as our mother, to see how all mother sentient beings have been so kind to us. The second step is to then remember their kindness. Remember how mother sentient beings have been so kind to us. The third step then is to then cultivate a wish to repay that kindness. Once we've cultivated a wish to repay their kindness, then we have the fourth and fifth step, which is great love or great loving kindness and great compassion. Great loving kindness and great compassion is not just, as in the four immeasurables, the wish for others or sentient beings to be free of suffering and have happiness. But the word great here implies that we are doing whatever we can to help mother sentient beings be free of suffering and find happiness. So it's not merely the aspiration, but it's actively helping mother sentient beings as much as we can. And then from that, we can move to step 6, which is often called altruistic intention. And altruistic intention is going to the next level of great loving kindness and great compassion, and that is to making it our personal responsibility to help liberate all mother sentient beings from suffering. I myself alone am going to make that my responsibility. So that's a big step. But of course, if we make that step to altruistic intention, then we can look at, well, in my current state, I can't really do much to help. How can I really begin to implement that aspiration? Is if I achieve full awakening, if I achieve enlightenment, then I can really begin to implement that. And of course, then that is the aspiration of bodhicitta. So that seventh step is bodhicitta. We would then cultivate that aspiration for enlightenment so that we can help benefit others. So these are the 7 steps. 6 was altruistic intention, making it our personal responsibility to help liberate all living beings from suffering. So 1 is seeing everyone as our mother. 2 is remembering their kindness. 3 is the wish to repay that kindness. 4 is great loving kindness. 5 is great compassion. 6 is altruistic intention. And 7 is bodhicitta. So this is the technique that was most widely taught historically. But again, if we have no belief in rebirth and have problems with our mother, it may be a bit difficult to implement this technique. The second technique, the one I want to focus more on now, I think is much more suitable for us in the modern world. The first step is equalizing self with others, and the reasoning here is similar to when we're cultivating equanimity, is to understand that we're all equal in wanting to be happy, wanting to be free of suffering. So that is what equalizing self with others means, is to put ourselves at the same level of others in terms of the aspiration to be happy and the aspiration to be free of suffering. The next 2 go together. The first of those is to reflect on the disadvantages of self-cherishing. And here the word self-cherishing is the selfish, self-centered attitude that sees my happiness as more important than the happiness of anyone else. And if we don't reflect on this self-cherishing mind, it may seem like actually this is our best friend bringing us happiness, this selfish motivation. And I think, unfortunately, quite often in our modern society, this attitude is promoted. You know, you're most important, look after number 1. Your happiness is most important. And it seems like that may actually be something helpful for us to find happiness. But actually, if we reflect on that attitude, it doesn't bring happiness, it just brings suffering. And that's what we are to do here, is to really reflect on what are the disadvantages of having this attitude. if we have this selfish, self-centered mind, putting our happiness above the happiness of others, then often that can lead to becoming obsessed about me and my happiness and me and my suffering. And then, of course, if we become obsessed about me and my suffering, then often, with that, often comes a lot of fear and anxiety about the world. Because everything out there is a potential threat to me. So I have to be on guard. Even my closest friends could hurt me, so I need to be on guard. So, of course, that's very stressful. And then often what happens is, together with that, we often become very sensitive to little things. We react to little things because we're like this. And then, of course, to protect ourselves from the supposed danger out there, we tend to build a big wall around ourselves to protect ourselves. So what we do is we cut ourselves off from others. And then, of course, we become isolated and loneliness follows. So people who are obsessed about their own happiness often tend to be very lonely people. And the fact that this is very stressful was sort of highlighted to me recently when I read an article, and it was about a medical study that they did. It was a very extensive medical study. I think it was either in Europe or North America. And the result of this medical study was that people who use the words I, me and mine a lot have a 35% greater risk of heart attack. So it seems like it might be a bit stressful, this me, me, me attitude. And then, of course, on the flip side, if we are obsessed about me and my happiness, then that happiness seems to be coming from out there, and then usually that leads to a lot of craving and attachment for things, frustration when we don't get it, dissatisfaction when it doesn't live up to our expectations. And then, of course, with this me first attitude, we tend to have an exaggerated sense of self-importance, and that leads to often a lack of consideration and respect for others. And then, of course, if we see others who seem to have more than us, usually jealousy follows. And then often we become very competitive with others, trying to outdo them and put them down. And then, of course, if we see people around us who seem to be at a lower level than us, often then that leads to being very arrogant and dismissive of them. And then, of course, if anyone will even go to the extent of harming others who stand in the way of our happiness. So, of course, if we harm others in the pursuit of our happiness, generally they harm us back. And then also, as we saw yesterday with the equanimity, is that with this me attitude, again, we tend to see every situation simply from the perspective of how is this situation affecting me. Then, due to that, we categorise people into these three groups of friend, stranger, enemy, from the perspective of how they're affecting us. So, of course, then we end up with attachment to friends, apathy to strangers, hostility, anger and hatred to difficult people. And then, of course, when it comes to cultivating loving kindness and compassion for others, very difficult. Loving kindness and compassion to our friends, okay, but only as long as they keep saying and doing things that make me happy, otherwise no. Loving kindness and compassion to the strangers, not really, couldn't care what happens to them, they're not affecting me. Loving kindness and compassion to the difficult people, no way. In fact, I hope they suffer, they deserve to suffer because they're harming me. So we won't be able to develop loving kindness and compassion in any pure way to anyone. So these are some of the disadvantages of the self-cherishing mind. And together with that, then we can reflect on the flip side of that. And that is to reflect on the advantages of cherishing others. And the advantages of cherishing others are basically the flip side of the disadvantages of self-cherishing. Because if we're cherishing others, then we're not going to be obsessed about me and my happiness, me and my suffering, which means we won't have all this fear and anxiety about the world. We won't be building a big wall around ourselves. We'll actually be more connected with others. And we won't be chasing after all that pleasure out there because we're really cherishing others. We're not obsessed about me and my happiness. And then, of course, we won't have an exaggerated sense of self-importance. We'll show consideration and respect for others. And instead of being jealous of others, we'll be happy for them, we'll rejoice. Instead of being competitive and arrogant, we'll help others around us. And then also, of course, we won't deliberately harm others in the pursuit of our happiness. And then, of course, we'll be able to more easily cultivate loving kindness and compassion to all living beings. Now, here, when we talk about cherishing others, we need to understand that correctly. Otherwise, we may get into difficulty with this one, in cherishing others. And I'll use a concrete example to highlight this. Some years ago, actually when I was in India teaching, was teaching this, and there was a person in the class who was a Danish primary school teacher. And he said 2 years previously he'd been there in India again, and he'd heard about this cherishing others, and he thought it was a fantastic idea. So he wanted to go back to Denmark and cherish his primary school children. And he tried to do that, but the result was a mess. The kids started misbehaving and it was a big disaster in his class. And then he really had a problem because he felt that cherishing others was the right thing to do, but the result was a disaster. But then slowly he understood cherishing others doesn't just mean sitting there smiling and saying nice things, because that's what he was doing, and the kids were going, oh, and started misbehaving. And so cherishing others, of course, means to benefit others. So if someone is behaving in a bad way, we need to help address that and help them to overcome that negative behaviour. If we don't do that, what will definitely happen, and you've probably experienced this a number of times already, you try and help someone and they take advantage of you. They step all over you. And then, of course, usually what happens when that happens, a number of times, then people go, this compassion stuff doesn't work because people are taking advantage of me. I'm just suffering. And then they give up compassion. Compassion always works. What's not working is there's a lack of wisdom. Because if we allow someone to take advantage of us when we're trying to help them, that's not very compassionate because we're in some ways contributing to their negative behaviour. So therefore, if we're helping someone and they're trying to take advantage of us, the compassionate thing to do is not tolerate that negative behaviour. Be very firm about that negative behaviour. And of course at the same time show compassion for the person, but not tolerate that negative behaviour. So we need to make sure here we always bring wisdom in. Otherwise, we'll become a doormat and people will walk over the top of us. Okay. Then, based on these two reflections, we can then move to the fourth step. And that is to exchange self with others, which means that in daily life, if we're about to engage in some activity and we notice a selfish motivation, then we replace or exchange that as much as possible with an attitude of cherishing others. And here we need to be very practical. Because sometimes when we go to help someone and we have a little bit of a selfish motivation, maybe we're expecting to get something back from them or something like that, then we may go, okay, I'm not going to help them because I'm doing it for a selfish reason. if we have this attitude, I think it's going to be difficult to begin to help others in general. Because I think at our level, whenever we help someone, at some level there's always going to be some selfishness there. So if we stop ourselves from engaging in virtuous behaviour because we notice a bit of selfish motivation, I think we're going to find it difficult to begin to help others at all. So rather, as suggested here, if you notice some selfish motivation when you're helping, reduce that as much as possible, increase the mind of cherishing others as much as possible, and still engage in that good deed, helping others. And then the fifth step...
Can you repeat please the last sentence?
So when we go to help others and we notice a little bit of selfish motivation, don't allow that to stop us from doing that good thing for them, but rather try to reduce that as much as possible and increase the mind of cherishing others as much as possible and still do that good deed, even if you still have some little bit of selfishness. And the fifth step is a meditative practice called Tong Len, giving and taking. And we're going to be looking at that practice tomorrow. That's going to be the topic for tomorrow afternoon. So what I'd like to do now is to do a meditation reflecting on the disadvantages of this self-cherishing mind. Any questions before we go to the meditation?
I want to ask I think that 4 and 5 are the same.
4 is more in daily life, and 5 is more in meditation.
But they're the same.
Same. Well, of course they're similar because they have a similar goal, but 4 is sort of the approach in daily life, and 5 is really the inner cultivation of that in meditation. So 4 will help 5 and 5 will help 4. So they'll both work together. So in any practice, again, we want meditation and daily life integrated. So 4 and 5 does that. That's the package. Yes.
4 is putting 3 into real action, right?
Yeah. So 4, if we really reflected on 2 and 3, 4 would be the natural follow-up. That we'd want to be doing 4. If we're not wanting to do this, I think we're not really much happening in stage 2 and 3. 2 and 3, if we really internalise, it would more or less naturally lead to 4. Okay, let's do the meditation. So we'll just reflect on some of these disadvantages of the self-cherishing mind. Setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. relaxing more deeply with each out breath. And with each out breath, letting go of any thoughts that may have arisen. Happily releasing them. Simply allowing the mind to come to rest in the present moment. Simply noticing the rhythm of the breath. The self-cherishing attitude is the selfish, self-centered mind which sees our happiness as more important than the happiness of anyone else. And with this attitude, not only do we see ourselves as separate from everyone else, but we see ourselves as the centre of the world. Everything revolves around us. And so we can reflect on what effect does this self-cherishing attitude have on us and those around us? And we can do this by reflecting on our own past experiences. Experiences where we had this self-cherishing attitude. So bring to mind some occasions in the past where you had this selfish state of mind and see what